In January 2021, I made a History Fragen episode discussing the Soviet Union, which did pretty darn well. It seems there was a solid group of people who appreciated that video. If you don't know, within said video I discussed the economic system of the former USSR and if it was really the proper representative of the communist ideology, as many are taught to believe. I came to the conclusion that every shred of evidence I found led me to believe it was not communist, and no, it wasn't socialist, it was rather a system known as Statism or state capitalism. Today I will be following that video up. This will be a discussion to basically teach you what every major economic system is and give you examples of it. I want to preface this by saying that this is based on lots of research, and I will do my best to not let any of that research be influenced by biases. But we'll start with ye olde economic system known as feudalism. Sorry to all you feudalists out there, all two of you, but I do have to say that feudalism was completely obliterated and is now considered a very archaic system. It was then replaced with capitalism, which is also considered by some to be an archaic system, but it's what virtually every country has to this day, whereas feudalism is completely obsolete. The system basically follows the idea that classes should be incredibly defined, with a major disparity between each of them. Feudalism has the big difference of association with a barter economy without exchange of money, but rather land and goods. Land ownership is somewhat similar to that of capitalism, but is more based on generational plots of land. But the major difference between feudalism and every other system is that there are set classes. Someone born into a poor family under feudalism could practically never become rich, whereas in a capitalist society, you could theoretically get the money to become part of the ruling class. Keep in mind the word theoretically for later, though. The classes of feudalism had royals and vassals at the top, with serfs and slaves at the bottom. It was a very clear, distinct group of classes that almost never changed. To better describe this, I have a quote from one of the founders of another ideology that we'll be taking a look at later, Karl Marx. And he says, "In pre-capitalist systems, it was obvious that most people did not control their own destiny. Under feudalism, for instance, serfs had to work for their lords. Capitalism seems different because people are in theory free to work for themselves or for others as they choose." This quote does a good job of explaining the difference between feudalism and capitalism, even if it may seem that they're a bit similar. It basically involves direct control from the ruling class, whereas a capitalist society kind of has a game of musical chairs at the beginning to see who gets rich, because you can't deny that in both of these systems, generational inheritance is a major factor. But in capitalism, it's more based on money than land. This is a very simple one. Capitalism is basically a game of survival of the fittest within the economy. It involves the most surface-level freedom of any of these systems because there is, specifically in laissez-faire capitalism, practically no control over the economy. This is from an ideological standpoint, of course. The capitalist system is what we see in America, England, Germany, Russia, Iran, Australia, and pretty much every other country you can think of. A few exceptions are not totally capitalist. But the vast majority of nations on this planet are, and have for a long time, been capitalist. I've distinguished it from feudalism and given you the incredibly simple rundown of what it is, but to truly understand it, we have to compare it to the other systems. Ready? Alright, let's go. Capitalism is different from socialism because it has private and corporate control of enterprise that doesn't involve the workers in any major way. Capitalism is different from communism because it involves private property, which is abolished in a communist system. In a communist country, you wouldn't be able to own an entire apartment complex. You would be allowed to own a house, a car, and a computer, but not your own solid land that you do not personally have a relationship with. It's a little hard to understand, so I'll get back to it when we discuss communism. Capitalism is also not statism because individual people control private property and enterprise rather than the government, like the system in the Soviet Union. So basically, capitalism is the one where individuals are given the most power without much intervention from the collective. In any system, there is individuality technically because these are economic and not social systems. But in terms of how some parts of the economy function, one ideology may favor the whole populace being able to make democratic economic decisions or individual rich people to control these decisions. It's the difference between empowering the higher or lower classes, and very commonly in capitalism, it empowers the higher ones. And now we arrive at the biggest boogeyman of an economic system to ever exist, though it's tied with communism for that title due to how they're so often confused: socialism. Socialism is relatively easy to understand in comparison to something such as feudalism. It's the idea that one should receive proper compensation based on their contribution to society, as the defining saying that can be used to recognize the system is, from each according to his ability, to each according to his contribution. This means that all members of society should contribute and work to their best ability, and the second part of that saying works as a sort of security that ensures such contributions will be recognized and properly compensated, which according to this ideology is either impossible or not prioritized under other systems, specifically capitalism. Socialism displays a more humanist set of ideas, and while capitalism is based on what those who follow it believe to be natural and efficient, socialism is based on what those who follow it believe to be the most efficient and the most moral. Democratic socialism, the ideology that has become extremely popular in many nations like America, the United Kingdom, and others, is not socialism. It does have this first aspect in common with true socialism, as democratic socialism seeks to redistribute the wealth in a more equal fashion, while also using the government to offer more programs that could help people out with things, and the poorest of people specifically. Wealth redistribution and more equality among members of all classes achieved through support provided to the working class known as the proletariat are major parts of socialism and the entirety of democratic socialism as economic ideologies. But socialism has yet another important aspect that is very rarely mentioned by democratic socialists, or at least the ones who are actually in power. Both of these seek to provide proper compensation to those working extremely hard in the working class and give them what they believe is a more fair sum of money while taking the excess wealth away from the richest of people who don't need most of the money that they have. But socialism is, ironically, more connected to democracy due to how it differentiates from democratic socialism. Many socialists believe that the term democratic socialism is inherently flawed, as it doesn't address real differences between it and socialism, but rather portrays socialism as innately non-democratic in order to be more acceptable to a mainstream that's absolutely terrified of the word socialism. Socialism is not a system that is at odds with democracy. Not at all. No economic system that we're talking about here is inherently so, because these are economic and not social or political systems. So anyone who claims that any of these are the same thing as fascism, or that something like, being required to get a vaccine is socialism, is clearly without proper knowledge of what these systems really are. And I don't necessarily blame them, since most countries don't find it very important to teach people in their school systems what these really are and mean beyond extremely basic and flawed explanations. Most of the knowledge people have on socialism is limited to them having read Animal Farm in school, and even that is totally mishandled, as many people grow up believing it was a scathing critique of socialism and communism when, in fact, the writer of the book himself was openly a socialist. The book was actually going after the system of statism that existed in the Soviet Union at the time, but most don't understand the differences between that and socialism. So what is the aspect of socialism that sets it apart from democratic socialism? Well, that would be, of all things, workplace democracy. In socialism, it is often stated that the worker should seize the means of production, of which many people don't understand the meaning. What that basically means is that all workers in a company should have some sort of say in the way that things are produced or carried out, and they should be able to decide the fates of the fruits of their labor, as the bosses are able to do in capitalism. This extends to worker co-ops, which is the idea of workers making most of, if not all, decisions in the company. Basically like a union with more power and more centrally implanted into the power structure of the company itself. This is the workplace equivalent of democracy, as in democracy things are decided by the majority of the overall population, and in this case by the majority of workers in a company. And while socialism is a somewhat hated system that has become much more accepted in recent years, communism is one which nearly everyone seems to revile. But is it really because of what communism as an ideology truly is? Let's find out. Communism is something that everyone and their grandma uses as a buzzword nowadays to get what they want. In America, it's especially grotesque how it's become misused. with uninformed citizens and purposefully inflammatory politicians alike, reducing its meaning down to some vague evil rather than the very clear economic system that it was originally created as. In the 1960s, American citizens called race-mixing communism, and in 2020 they called mask mandates communism. In the 50s, Kevin McCarthy started a witch hunt for communists in the government, based on the fear of the Soviet Union in order to become more popular and seem like an American hero. And in the 2020s, tons of politicians in both of the major parties constantly attack the idea without ever really explaining why they hate it so much. For what feels like forever now, it's been a political punching bag because it's apparently such a horrific tragedy of an idea. But what is it actually? Well, it has everything socialism has, as socialism is basically the transitional stage between capitalism and communism, but it adds on to that the abolition of private property. Now, moving past the stage of purely conflating statism and communism, most people start to lose their minds around this point. They think that this means no ownership is permitted under a communist system. However, that is actually incorrect, as private property does not refer to something you own as a whole, but rather something that you own purely due to its value when exchanging. Personal property is still allowed, and those are things that you actually use personally, such as a computer, food, a house that you live in, a car that you drive, etc. Things that you use or have a personal tether to are still yours. That's very important, and in fact, communism respects the idea of owning things that you truly care about quite a bit, as it basically prohibits only the ownership of things you'd totally be willing to give away, because that's the only reason you own them. You surely wouldn't just sell your computer if you're still using and enjoying it. Same with your house, but in a capitalist or socialist system with private ownership, the ruling class, known as the bourgeoisie, does own many pieces of property purely due to the money they can get from selling them, not because of any personal use that they have with it. This is what communism really has a problem with, as it wouldn't be allowed for one to own a whole apartment complex purely to profit off of others' need for shelter under it, as that's considered exploiting a human right for monetary gain, similar to how even democratic socialism condemns the idea of charging for medical care in countries like America because it exploits the very natural idea of being sick just for the companies to profit. Communism condemns doing such a practice with really anything. Instead, things are produced so they can actually be used by all who need them, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. This means that all should work as hard as is reasonable in order to contribute to society, and in return they will have everything they need, not really want, but need. In capitalism, one could work as hard as humanly possible and still barely scrape by due to the circumstances and prices for things being used as capital, while someone who has been born into a rich family wouldn't have to work nearly as much and would always get what they need to survive without issue. Communism does not entail making every single person equal in some forced, restrictive way. It seeks to alter things in a way it believes to be more fair, by giving people the things they need and not having anything produced to have value purely for how it can be exchanged for money. And while that explains what exactly personal and private property have as differences, that should clear some things up for those who have misconceptions about that aspect of the ideology, there are many people who simply detest communism and socialism because they associate it with countries like the Soviet Union and China. But really, those countries operate in a different way, which I will now explain. And here we are with the system that many people don't discuss due to it being excluded from classification when economic systems are talked about. Statism is probably the easiest system to understand. It's basically like capitalism, where one group holds capital and thus power, which creates a hierarchy. However, in statism, there is the key difference of personal capitalists not having this capital and power, but rather the government. Rather than all property being treated as a public good that can become personal property like in communism, or being available to own for any reasons if you have the proper materials to exchange for it, almost always being money, like in capitalism, the government owns this and is meant to provide this to the people at their whim. Furthermore, the government also oversees the means of production and has direct influence over all industry, with no private industry or worker co-ops. Government officials are meant to lead the businesses which are directly connected to the government and the workers, nor a privately appointed boss is able to control the destiny of the company, as it basically works as an economic wing of the leadership of the country. This is what existed in the Soviet Union, China, and many other countries, as mounds of evidence that I'll link in the description show that the government remained in control of both of these things. And if you don't think you can take my word for it, check out these sources and find out for yourself. So I think you can see why these countries weren't communist or socialist. It's because their systems entail industry being controlled by the total population, which has direct control rather than the government stepping in to take over, and the public is meant to own the things that they wish to use at their own whim, rather than the government deciding whether or not to provide them. And if you're wondering why those countries can't have workplace democracy when the workplace is controlled by the government, it's because their governments were never democratically elected. They had authoritarian governments, and due to the fusion of political and economic systems under statism, that prohibits any true workplace democracy or equal distribution of direct property, or in the case of what would be socialism, wealth. So, all in all, there are many misconceptions about all economic systems, and I wanted to clear up what exactly these words that you hear floating around all mean, while explaining some other stuff to give you all more of an idea of the concepts that define each of these. If you want to learn more, I recommend reading through the sources that I have linked in the description, and if you find anything I said in this video is inaccurate, or if you found something especially interesting or educational and want to tell me about it, let me know in the comments. That's all for this entry of History Fragen. Be safe everyone, and goodbye.